Okay, so we're back to the PowerPoint. So the brain has the cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres. The layer just below the cerebral hemispheres is the diencephalon, where the thalamus and epithalamus are. The midbrain is below that, then the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. So if we look at the surface view of the brain, these structures are going to be seen in the sheep brain. You'll have the sheep brain presented in Webber-sign. So you have a longitudinal fissure, and you have a right cerebral hemisphere and a left. You have these little hills, so to speak, these curvy hills are called a gyrus. The valleys in between the hills is called a sulcus. So the cerebral hemisphere is arranged in a very, very compact winding together here so that you can get as much nervous matter into the cerebral hemispheres. If you look at a lateral view of the brain, the precentral gyrus has a postcentral gyrus behind it and a precentral gyrus in front of it. This is going to be a processing center for somatosensory information, for afferent impulses that get to this part of the brain, carried up through the thalamus, and so on. So somatosensory input is analyzed here. In the precentral gyrus, you're going to have motor output, efferent output. So the analysis of all the sensory input that passes through the spinal cord and goes up to the brain is in the postcentral gyrus. Once that's processed, the precentral gyrus sends information. So when you sit down, you constantly have information of the position of your joints, the state of contraction on your muscles. As soon as you get up, the position of the joints change, the stretching of the muscles may change, the contraction of the muscles are then adjusted so that you can stand up and walk. We look at a cross section of the brain, and these will be very similar structures in the sheep brain. The corpus callosum is the white matter that connects the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Here's the diencephalon, the thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland. And you have the mammillary body, and this is the thalamus here. I'm sorry, the hypothalamus is the lower part, and the thalamus. So once information is carried up the spinal cord, that's routed to the left and right cerebral hemispheres by the thalamus. Here's a parieto-occipital sulcus. The sulcus is a large split between segments of the brain. Then you have the cerebellum, which is called the little brain, which is involved in balance and learning to do repetitive activities such as riding a bike, playing tennis, and coordinating your vision. The midbrain, the brainstem, has the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Then it's on to the spinal cord. So the brain has vesicles. These chambers produce and are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, which is produced in structures called the choroid plexus, which is blood vessels mixed with nervous tissue. These ventricles circulate the cerebral spinal fluid all around through the brain and in the subarachnoid space. And this fluid is very, very important. If you ever get a spinal tap, your brain gets very, very disgusted and mad at you because anytime you change the volume of the cerebral spinal fluid, the brain undergoes enormous pain. So if you ever have a analysis of your cerebral spinal fluid, unlikely you'll suffer enormous pain for a while. So these ventricles of the brain you have the lateral ventricles, then the third ventricle, and the fourth, and they're all connected. So, for instance, the mesencephalic aqueduct takes information from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricles are a pair. They're quite extensive in the right above the diencephalon, and this fluid also goes throughout the spinal cord, and it's circulated around the brain in the subarachnoid part of the arachnoid layer. So the circulation of the cerebral spinal fluid is all throughout the arachnoid layer, and it's constantly circulated and returned to the ventricles of the brain, and it goes from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle and so on, and it goes throughout the central canal of the spinal cord. So it's being moved around the brain so that all brain parts are exposed through the subarachnoid space below the arachnoid layer. Okay. So it's formed in, so here's the subdural space, here's the arachnoid layer, and the parts of the arachnoid layer are going to help make, when it's close to blood vessels, and to circulate the cerebral spinal fluid. So what does the cerebrum do? Let's stop there and create another short